As a literary device, few can claim as much varied and sundry usage as madness, an immensely influential word and concept in literature as well as socially and medicinally. This can be attributed to the myriad interpretations of what madness looks like or is, though one would be hard-pressed to find a work of literature more steeped in or culturally significant to our literary understanding of the concept of madness than Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. With a staggering 84 film and television adaptations across the world that I could find, and more on the way, its impact on modern literature is difficult to overstate. Originally a tale concocted to entertain the Liddell sisters, one of whom the book is presumably named after, Alice Liddell, Lewis Carroll penned the story and published it for children everywhere to enjoy in 1865 with the assistance of John Tenniel, who provided the illustrations, many of which will be shown throughout this essay. The nature of Carroll's relationship to the Liddell sisters, predominantly Alice, is still debated to this day, but there is a notable amount of evidence to suggest that Carroll's well-documented friendships with children of the Oxford area was less than completely innocent. Many photographs of children wearing very little or nothing at all have been found to have been in his possession, though the content of the photographs has been argued to be more focused on innocence than sexualization. While the focus of this essay is not on Lewis Carroll's personal life and relationships, I find it pertinent to address these observations for the sake of the interpretation of the novel. Regardless of one's personal beliefs on who Carroll was behind the writing, the gap between innocence and sexualization is important to explore within the context of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, as the book can be seen as a metaphor for the confusion of transitioning from childhood to adulthood. The parallel between the journey away from innocence and the journey away from childhood is undeniable, though Alice's Adventures in Wonderland makes use of a burgeoning style of writing to obfuscate the more obvious comparisons. During the Victorian era, a new genre, nonsense literature, was emerging, popularized by authors such as Lewis Carroll and Edward Lear, author of works such as A Book of Nonsense, The Jumblies, and other works of children's literature. While primarily a genre aimed at children with its exaggerated and impossible depictions of strange lands and peoples, these oddities provided a platform to make philosophical and societal observations that would be otherwise lost in more serious works. Quote, "Nonsense texts, as is apparent in the emblematic figure of Humpty Dumpty, mimic the activities of literary critics and philosophers, only in an excessive and subversive way. In so doing, they express intuitions that often escape more serious practitioners of the art. They also, of course, fail to produce the same result, a coherent interpretation of the text being read. Excess always compensates for lack. The lack of results, of seriousness, can be seen as the necessary loss in order to gain new intuitions. In their nonsensicality, or madness, nonsense texts are often more perceptive, or imaginative, or intuitive than straightforward readings." Let's circle. These fantastical, mad descriptions give Carroll and other authors who practice a similar literary style the leeway to observe things such as childhood and madness through a separate lens less constrained by literary standard and the need for everything to make perfect sense at every turn. It seems only fitting that our example given in text concerning nonsense poetry is Humpty Dumpty, as they are one of the many bizarre encounters Alice has in her time in Wonderland. Eating tea cakes and drinking out of bottles that make you larger or smaller is textbook nonsense, yet it retains a grain of insightful criticism of the bodily standards that women were expected to uphold. The question of what defines womanhood in the Victorian era of England is a heavily layered one, and I appreciate you giving a young American man in 2024 an opportunity to answer it. Let's not drop the bag, huh? A woman in the Victorian era was expected to be extremely groomed, a trend that spread from the upper class during Queen Victoria's reign. Such grooming practices expected of a good woman of the time included the removal of body hair for aesthetic and hygienic reasons through harmful chemicals like coal tar, lead, magnesium, oxalic acid, and more. Victorian art didn't help either, as artists, mostly men, depicted women as pale, extremely well-groomed, and youthful. This expectation of women of high class bled into lower classes that began trying to emulate those above them on the social ladder, leading to practices such as daily bathing. While there was nothing wrong with bathing every day or dyeing one's hair, it is interesting to note that its proliferation began as an attempt to mimic royalty in the upper class, who themselves were driven by the belief that cleanliness equals morality. Corsets are an additional staple of the time, a similar practice to Chinese foot binding, as it was intended to reshape the woman's body permanently over time in an attempt to create an hourglass figure. Waist sizes of corsets during this era average at about 22 inches, with some reaching as narrow as 16 inches. As for defining womanhood itself, it's probably best to start with something oh so lovingly referred to as the cult of domesticity, or if you're feeling fancy, the cult of true womanhood. These cults are one and the same. less of an organization of shadowy worshippers to an unaccepted deity, and more so a collectively held societal belief that women should keep to a private, domestic lifestyle and practice a certain set of values that can be distilled into 4 pillars: purity, piety, submissiveness, and domesticity. Public reinforcement of these ideals can be found in print media of the time, such as Godey's Lady's Book, a woman's magazine that ran from 1830 to 1898. While this magazine was published in Philadelphia and regularly advocated for things like women's education, they were not a force of counterculture, having entries that ideologically supported the cult of domesticity, such as their editor Sarah Joseph Hale, who in 1850 wrote, quote, "There is a beautiful parallelism between the condition of woman in her domestic life and the character of a nation," end quote. And now, a quote I'd be shocked if you were wholly unfamiliar with. "We're all mad here. I'm mad, you're mad." If you weren't familiar, that's a quote from the Cheshire Cat, a talking cat whose grin remains after his head has disappeared. If that isn't an indicator of the landscape we're dealing with, I don't know what is. But on the topic of madness, let's talk hysteria. Historically, a massively culturally significant diagnosis that can be traced back some 4,000 years and even has roots in psychological studies from as recent as the 20th century, thanks to Sigmund Freud. First described in approximately 1900 BC, though it wouldn't be named hysteria until Hippocrates in the 5th century BC, an Egyptian physician records, quote, "hysterical disorders and spontaneous uterus movement," end quote, as well as hysteria being recorded in an ancient medical document from 1600 BC, again in reference to physical problems with the uterus. It wasn't until the Greeks that the concept of hysteria undertook a more modern definition, though modern in this case is still more than a century outdated, speaking more to the mental state of someone, a diagnosis notably reserved for women. In fact, we derive the word hysteria from the Greek hystera, their word for uterus, believing the phenomena to be caused by a wandering womb. Melampus, an Argonaut and a physician, is bestowed by history with the mantle of having founded the idea of our modern definition of hysteria. In the article Women in Hysteria in the History of Mental Health, the authors write about Melampus, saying, quote, "He placated the revolt of Argo's virgins who refused to honor the phallus and fled to the mountains, their behavior being taken for madness," end quote. Pause in the indignation you feel hearing that, and allow me to continue to tell you how he cured these women. Through use of hellebore, a flowering plant, many strains of which are poisonous, and the sexual company of young, strong men. According to those recording the story from millennia ago, the women were cured, and Melampus posited that their uterus had been, quote, "poisoned by venomous humors due to a lack of orgasms and uterine melancholy," end quote. Okay, now you may release the indignation, and we're going to talk through it all. As horrifying as it is to look back and see a real medical issue being handled with all the grace of a horny rhinoceros, it's incredibly important to allow this to recontextualize future dealings with the concept of hysteria. As time went on, especially during heavy spikes in religious fervor or social upheaval, hysteria could often become associated with demonic possession or similar lack of religious or moral righteousness. It wasn't until the Victorian era, however, that we saw a massive uptick in the number of hysteria diagnoses. To no one's surprise, it was predominantly women who received this large influx of diagnoses. A French physician by the name of Joseph Rowlin described hysteria as a vaporous ailment, affection vaporeuse in French, an illness spread through air pollution in large urban areas. While Rowlin noted that both men and women could contract hysteria, women were, according to him, were predisposed to this ailment because of their lazy and irritable nature. The primary treatment prescribed in the 19th century for female hysteria was known as rest cure, which promoted an avoidance of physical/intellectual stimulation or strain on women diagnosed with the condition, whereas the rare occasion of a man being diagnosed was usually set apart from his female counterparts, as doctors recommended physical exercise and time outside to their male patients. These prescriptions and the difference between their assignments is laughable, especially when considering the symptoms of hysteria as they were documented in Victorian England included, quote, a swollen abdomen, suffocating angina, chest pain, or dyspnea, shortness of breath, dysphagia, difficulty swallowing, cold extremities, tears and laughter, oscitation, yawning, pandiculation, stretching and yawning, delirium, a close and driving pulse, and abundant and clear urine, end quote. A brief closing note on the history of hysteria and its treatments. There is a modern narrative that vibrators were created to treat hysteria in female patients. This was popularized by a 1999 book written by Rachel Maines called The Technology of Orgasm, and a 2011 movie called Hysteria, which references Maines' book. There is no conclusive evidence for Maines' hypothesis that vibrators were created to treat hysteria, but the device was marketed in its early days as a cure-all domestic and medicinal appliance. I would be the mad one if I didn't bring up the Hatter here, whom some of you may already know to be based on the very real expression, mad as a hatter, stemming from the phenomenon of hat makers being exposed to large amounts of mercury over time while curing pelts, which led to physical and mental health problems such as dementia. Carroll's Mad Hatter, however, wasn't simply based on a turn of phrase. It speculated with some certainty that the Mad Hatter was based on a man who lived in the same town as Carroll, Theophilus Carter, who was known around Oxford as the Mad Hatter. Tenniel's illustration gives further evidence of this claim, as Carter was described as, quote, having a prominent nose and receding chin while wearing a top hat on the back of his head, end quote. An article by Rosie Lesso mentions a few interpretations of his role within the story, all of which may be true simultaneously. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, while nonsensical, is a potent critique on Victorian society masquerading as a children's novel, and the Mad Hatter is an eccentric and can be unpleasant or confusing, but is ultimately harmless within the story. Lesso posits that Carroll was attempting to explore, quote, how he might approach the mad or insane with greater empathy and understanding, and that he highlights how difficult it might be to find sense or meaning in contradictory and unpredictable behavior for those on the brink of adulthood, such as Alice, end quote. Madness born of power, as represented by the Queen of Hearts, is the only madness within the novel that is actually harmful to any degree, as seen in her many demands for her subjects' heads. In fact, Carroll seems to be incredibly aware of this as he fashions the Queen of Hearts after Queen Victoria, whose role in Victorian femininity and expectations of women at the time had a rather maddening effect. The inclusion of a royal character whose madness exists as a threat, whereas most other instances are completely benign, cannot be discounted in the re-examination of the story. The implication that power breeds malignant madness demonstrates Carroll's views on Queen Victoria's influence on England and its inhabitants. While these observations on the story of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and their historical context may be interesting or entertaining by themselves, it is important to discuss how these themes affect Alice and our interpretations of her story. The dreamlike quality of the story, as well as its implication that it was all in Alice's sleeping head, further adds to the credence of this story being read as a critique of certain Victorian cultures as they subconsciously affect the mind of a young girl. The story's existence within a child's subconscious opens the door for nonsense literature to address more sensitive topics like the transition from childhood to adulthood and the burdens of social expectations without ever actually commenting on them. A young girl in Victorian England embodies both angelic innocence and potential of beauty, a confusing combination for those whom it is thrust upon. This idea of confusing transitions between bodies is highlighted particularly well by the presence of Alice's exaggerated physical transformations, as her body shrinks, grows, and alters its proportions as she interacts with Wonderland. The impossibility of attaining the ideal Victorian body standard is emphasized by her lack of control over her own size. Alice's intelligence is also subject to Victorian standards, as she is called stupid or foolish, and ultimately intellectually infantilized throughout the story by characters such as the Caterpillar, despite her clear curiosity and independence. Carroll's views on madness, despite having clear sympathy for the mad, are ultimately gendered in a way indicative to the time period in which Alice's Adventures in Wonderland was written. The madness that pervades the world shapes itself differently across characters, and while male-coded figures such as the Mad Hatter and the Cheshire Cat are mad, they present no threat or danger to Alice, whereas the Duchess is considered cruel or neglectful for her madness, and the Queen of Hearts is rendered dangerously insane by her madness, which illustrates itself in cries for people's heads over the most minor of occurrences. Whether Carroll's gendered views on madness may be intentional or not, they create a clear critique of Queen Victoria's influence on emerging social norms that, by today's standards, are considered oppressive. Ultimately, Wonderland's existence as a child's dream sets the stage for it to explore and highlight absurdities of the real world under the guise of nonsensical fantasy, facilitating a potent critique of fluid ideas like gender roles and personal identity that are placed into rigid frameworks in our real world. Yet, within this dream world, Alice is allowed to confront these maddening and constraining ideas with critical thinking and assert her agency. "You're nothing but a pack of cards," demonstrates her coming to terms with the nonsense of Wonderland and the real world it reflects, and confronting it, marking her as something of an early feminist character in 19th century literature. I want to thank you very much for watching this video essay on madness and Victorian femininity as it relates to Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Since this is YouTube, if you enjoyed it, go ahead and let me know by hitting the like button or leaving a comment, and have a great rest of your day.